Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Joan Urschler, the Director of the Early Childhood Program here at the Weissman Center. And this is the last of our Early Childhood Seminar Series, and we're very, very happy, lucky, fortunate to have Professor Beth Grau from the School of Education, Department of Curriculum and Instruction. And she's going to be talking about 4K, 4-year-old kindergarten, which some of you may be familiar with, maybe not, but how that fits into the K-12 spectrum of education in public schools. And I just want to mention this morning, one of the articles in the New York Times was about the mayor of New York City proposing universal pre-K for 3-year-olds. They already have it for 4-year-olds, which has, huge implications in terms of what we know about young children's development and how they learn. So Beth's talk will help inform our ideas about the possibility of having 3K as well as 4K. Milwaukee already has a 3K program for some of its kids too. So anyway, happy to introduce Beth.
Thanks, Joan.
And I'm going to be passing around this small piece of paper. If you could please sign in, I would appreciate it. Thanks.
So good afternoon, everybody. Could I have a show of hands? How many people are students here? Okay, how many people are teachers? How many people are student teachers? Researchers? Parents? Okay. All right. Well, thank you for coming on this beautiful day. I can't imagine what it must be like to come inside on a day like today if you had a choice. I will say that many of the people in the room are from my early childhood policy and practice class, and I just found out today that I had told them that on the 25th we would be going to a talk at the Weissman Center. They didn't know that it was me talking until they looked at the blurb about it. So apparently I forgot some significant pieces of information, but I'm glad they came anyway. I'm going to be talking about a study that I have been working on with my colleague Sharon Ryan from Rutgers, and now she's at Bank Street College of Education, where we decided to try to understand what happens in pre-K. There are a lot of people that do research with big tables and numbers and inputs and outputs, and we wanted to see what life day-to-day was like in pre-K. But to start with, I need to lay the groundwork a little bit. And I wanted to, I think probably if you're in early childhood, you recognize that early childhood is this weird amalgam of things, that it's designated as birth to age 8, and I'll tell you that no one can tell me why that is. Anybody here know why? I've reached out to historians, psychologists. No one can tell me why it's birth to 8. The only thing I can see is it happens to fit within a Piagetian frame through concrete operations. But if you find out, will you email me and tell me? Because I've been looking and looking for a long time. But if you think about children from birth to age 8, you'll be looking at a variety of contexts. You'll be looking at of children and related contexts. So you're looking at infants, toddlers, preschoolers, kindergartners, grade 1 through 3. You'll be looking at homes, family child care homes, centers, for-profit, nonprofit centers, public pre-K programs, and elementary school. But then you've got this weird overlap that currently has the elementary institution dealing with kindergarten, grade 1, 2, 3, and increasingly reaching out to 4K. And the institutions that deal with the early childhood and the elementary pieces are actually very different. you will have different state departments typically that are looking at what you do with early childhood programs in the period before kindergarten, and a completely different set of assumptions, resources, materials that you have once you get into the elementary area. So part of the story is that we're learning about what it means for 4K in Wisconsin or pre-K in other states to sit at this kind of liminal place between early childhood and elementary school. So I think much of the elementary or the early childhood community works around the idea of developmentally appropriate practices. And that is designed to deal with three specific components. It's looking at knowledge of typical development. So what do we know about the typical development of children? And I can, maybe you could have Clark provide you with these slides rather than people writing things down. I'm happy to have you have them. It looks at knowledge of typical development. It looks at knowledge of the development of an individual child, whoops. And it's also the cultural resources and meanings that a child brings to school. And so we hope that when teachers use developmentally appropriate practices, whether it's with typically or atypically developing children, that they'll triangulate among these three sources of knowledge to be able to make good decisions about what a child does, all right? That comes up in opposition to the standards movement. Whereas you were starting with knowledge of the child with developmentally appropriate practice, the standards movement is looking at endpoints. It's orienting you, providing a different kinds of triangulation for you to set your horizon in a particular way. So that it came about because of the importance of having clear expectations for all children, and then tailoring instruction to ensure that all children can meet those standards. Now, it's a slight shift from early versions of DAP, which were more experience-based and less focused on individual children. The standards movement isn't inherently related to accountability, but the two ideas are conflated often because the juice that comes with the standards movement, particularly in K-12, comes out of accountability systems. Now, there are a number of kinds of standards, and it's interesting that in 2006, when Barbara Bowman spoke about standards at NAEYC, her speech was actually boycotted because people were so concerned about the use of standards in early childhood education. So she laid out 4 kinds of standards in her work. She talked about program standards. Those are the inputs, so things like teacher-child ratio, room size, those kinds of things. Content standards, which are the things that you teach. Performance standards, which are the outcomes. And professional development standards, which are the standards that support teachers. This is a very particular way of thinking about standards that is unique to the early childhood community. It doesn't play out as richly in the K-12 accountability movement. But this is an example of how many in the early childhood community were worried about what would happen in early childhood related to standards. Amos Hatch, who was one of my favorite people in the world, said, "Best early childhood programs are those that give children opportunities to explore meaningful content in meaningful ways. Substituting a narrow skills-based approach for a dynamic child-responsive curriculum will rob children of the joy of discovering how much they can learn and just how fulfilling school experiences can be." So in 2002, which was before Good Start, Grow Smart, or the things that went into early childhood, he was saying, let's think about this and see what happens. So I'd like you to keep this in your mind as I talk about what happened in schools in New Jersey and Wisconsin. So the research question that we addressed in this particular study was, are early learning standards refocusing the early childhood curriculum toward academic instruction? And I will say that I actually just found this ad for something you can buy called Preparing Preschoolers for the Common Core. If I were Oprah, I would have one under each of your seats because I think it's so good. It kind of took my breath away when I thought that we would start preparing children for the Common Core when they're in preschool. But I think that life might be something that would prepare a preschooler for the Common Core, but that's me. The study that I'm going to be talking about is a study that we called Life in Pre-K. It was funded by the Spencer Foundation, and I did it with my friend Sharon Ryan. We did multi-state case studies in 2 states. And we chose 2 states but for one reason, because each of us lived in one. But more importantly, the empirical reason was that we wanted to compare a targeted program in a highly regulated state program. So New Jersey has a highly regulated program with so many rules, so many administrative layers that it's kind of stunning. And the idea is, if you want quality early childhood, you have to put in place the structures that will help people do the right thing. Okay, so they took the research on early childhood education and made a set of regulations. In contrast, we compared that to Wisconsin, which is a universal program in districts that provide 4K, and it's a mid-range regulation program. So while I think Wisconsin hits 5 of the National Institute for Early Education Research's pre-K benchmarks, whereas New Jersey hits all but 1, I think. And we wanted to compare what would happen, what would pre-K be like if you structured it in a way that really, really tried to scaffold high-quality research-based work versus what do we see in a program that takes as its bottom line local control, that you will get high-quality programming if the programming reflects the community. Okay? And so I'll just very briefly go through the research methods. It was a multi-level policy study, so we did a state policy analysis where we did interviews with state actors, so people in DPI, people in DCS, legislators of different types, people in DPI, and then they helped us, and they did that as well on the New Jersey side. We had the state people help us choose districts in which to do our studies, because in both states they had people that were well aware of the programming. And we wanted programming that we saw as mature pre-K programming, so it's not something that just started last year. And so we asked them to choose 3 kinds of districts for us. We wanted urban, semi-urban, and rural schools that had a mixture of sites in their work. And so you'll see characteristics in a minute about what the districts look like. We did interviews with district leaders related to pre-K, so we talked to superintendents, principals, early childhood coordinators. We then had them help us choose 4K programs in those districts. So we interviewed the district people related to 4K, and then we worked with teachers where we did case studies, interviewing them multiple times. We had them do a time diary interview. We collected artifacts like lesson plans. And then the most fun part was looking at the 4K program from the perspective of a 4K child. So in each site, we followed 2 focal children over the course of the year, doing things like doing home to school interviews. So the very first one I did is I went the day after Halloween to a child's house and was met at the door by his father in his boxer shorts eating Halloween candy, and his son was standing in front of the TV eating Halloween candy and drinking Orange Crush. It's a vision that I couldn't get from staying on the school site. But this allowed us to really look at what children's 4K experiences were like. And we did data collection from the 2012 through December of 2013, and we followed the children from 4K into 5K to see how their experience was the same or different. Okay. So we had many diverse data sources, and here I'm just going to give you a glance at some of them. Up on the upper left is an example of field notes. And so what we do is we would detail what children were doing as they related to what was going on in the classroom. And in those field notes, we embedded pictures of our focal children. So the child you see there is a child I called Amara, who was sitting attentively, as she always did, in class. You can also see, let me out of here, there. The Dixon Community Preschool Guidelines. This provides what the district that Amara and Timothy were in, how they structured their program. So this is their standards and mission. And then on the far right is an interview format. If you've ever tried to interview a 4-year-old, it's not that they can't tell you. You have to find out what the questions are that will allow them to share their knowledge. So one of the things we did is we had them do photographic interviews, where for a day I would follow them and they could decide when they were going to take a picture, and they would write about it. So here we have a picture of Timothy. It says, "This one I'm learning letters with Ms. Zelda." And this is related to the topic for the day because this is during their outside time. And the teachers had started pulling children out during the outside time to start teaching, providing content. Okay? Oops. Oh, let's see if we'll go there. The analysis, we're almost done with the methods part, I promise, was a recursive process, meaning that we both collected data and analyzed at the same time, and we're still doing analysis on these data. And those data came out of transcribed interviews, the field notes, and documents of different kinds. All right? Now, first I want to show you how New Jersey and Wisconsin are different. So if you look, New Jersey has a targeted program, and they have full-day programs for 3- and 4-year-olds. Wisconsin is a universal program for 4-year-olds only. Teacher certification, you need to have an early childhood certificate as the head teacher. You don't have to have a certificate to be a required teacher's assistant. You have to have an early childhood certificate. In Wisconsin, you are not required to have any kind of teaching assistant in the classroom. The length of day is school day in New Jersey, half day in Wisconsin. In both states, they use mixed delivery methods, so they include school sites, childcare sites, and Head Start sites. The curriculum in New Jersey, you have to use a state-approved curriculum, and there are only 4 that they allow. They use Tools of the Mind, Creative Curriculum, and I can't remember the other 2 right now. Okay? Whereas Wisconsin just says that the curriculum that you use has to be aligned with the Wisconsin Model Early Learning Standards. Okay? The teacher pay in New Jersey is they have a state rate for teachers, and regardless of where you teach, you get the state rate. Whereas in Wisconsin, teachers are paid at the market rate, which means that teachers in childcare centers get the local child care amount. And the Head Start folks get paid on the Head Start schedule. And we all know what the public school folks get. So there's a broad range in the kind of pay that people get. Class size, you're not allowed to have any more than 15 in a classroom with a teacher and an aide. There is not a class size specified for Wisconsin. So you can have, I've heard horror stories of a large urban center in the east of a particular state that has lakes in it, where they have 33 4-year-olds in a classroom with only one teacher. And that's because it's unspecified in the law, okay? So now I want to just talk you briefly through what the sites were. These are all pseudonyms, and you're not expected to see all of them. You'll see if you look at the population that our urban school, Dixon, was only slightly bigger than their rural school. So these are all set with census definitions, which are related to local norms. So they had a much larger group that they were drawing from. And there were a range of different kinds of sites. So, for example, we went from an off-site converted classroom behind a large high school. You've seen those prefab buildings. That was what they had in one place, versus in Wisconsin and Pickering, the classroom was in a rural school. The one school that the city had that held kids from 4K all the way through high school. So there was a huge range in terms of what the sites were like. So are there any questions so far in terms of everything I've thrown at you in terms of the study, the states, the sites? Nicholas?
Can you explain the difference between the targeted and universal programs and how they influence your study?
The targeted, New Jersey came out of an equity claim saying that the state was not providing adequate funding for children from low-income homes. And so they invested money to be able to provide a full-day program for 3 and 4-year-olds in the 31 to 33 highest poverty districts in the state, okay? And so the children that have those programs are from low-income homes. There is a possibility that people can get into the programming if they have other kinds of needs, but primarily it's poverty for which children are placed. In Wisconsin, any district that provides 4K has to offer it to everybody in the district. And so it's not targeted to particular programs. It's also only half day. And so you have different kinds of infrastructures in each of the contexts. It was surprising at how much alike the programs were across the two states, regardless of what the characteristics were. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions?
How many sites in all?
We had 6 sites in all. There was 3 in each state. And say, for example, in Wisconsin, I did field work in the Dixon site. I visited there weekly for the half-day period every week through the school year. So, and then there were a number of days where I went in and stayed a whole day to follow a child through wraparound care. Oops. And so there were, this 3 was then varied across rural, urban, and semi-urban, and then school site, childcare, and Head Start. interestingly, in Wisconsin, we did not have a Head Start site because the Head Start group in Dixon was very wary of having anybody from UW doing research. And so we went to another child care center. Okay. All right, so now is where the fun part comes, because now we'll start talking about practice. And what I want to do is talk about the role of standards in what people's experiences were like in 4K. So the official view of standards, when you talk to school district people, when you talk to people from NAYC, they'll say that standards are to guide practice and to ensure that we have appropriate investments in programs so that they can provide the kind of experiences that kids deserve. And what you'll see, and this is kind of foreshadowing, is that what we had was a clash between developmentally appropriate practices and a narrow view of what school readiness is, as in academic content, and we'll talk about what the reasoning behind that is. Okay? So we're going to start talking about Wisconsin over and over again. And I will tell you that these pictures are a mixture of pictures that we took in a site and pictures I just took out of Google Images. So if you see somebody you know, wave. Okay? So I was told over and over again that 4K was evolving. And this was interesting in that the sites that we looked at in Wisconsin had all been part of 4K since the money was reinvested in the 80s. And what they said is, what we were told by Renee Jensen, who was a 4K teacher at Belford, which was a child care center. In Belford, they only had sites and child care centers. She said, when we started 4K, it was like, you don't need to stress letters, you don't need to stress anything, just a brief overview. They really wanted a lot of social skills. So she had been a teacher in 4K since the instantiation of the program. Others in that area had some other ideas. This is the former superintendent in Belford, Keith Deitch, and he said, I remember definite comments that our kids are better prepared. That to me was the idea, to have the transition, to have that foundation. So they're ready when they come to kindergarten, that they do some things that we expected. Unfortunately, kindergarten used to be a place of play, and you didn't start to read until first grade. That's not the situation anymore. And maybe we'll have 3K someday. I hope not. So he was looking backwards in terms of his practice and how having 4K provided their district with a group of kids that were coming in to 5K with a strong foundation of skills. The new superintendent, who I called Stacy Clifford, said, we can't afford for kindergarten to be colors and counting and pretend and memorizing ABCs. It can't be. It really has to be reading readiness. It has to be math concept ready. They need to, and this is how she did, they need to be ready to go. The social piece of sitting and crying in the corner for the first week of school, we haven't got a week to lose. Every time I read that, I go, but this is kind of the first generation of people that have been working in elementary school with standards and alignment of programming. So the idea that you want to have everything aligned so that you set things up for success at the next level. Another teacher named Diana Lanham, who taught at Pickering, this was the school where they only had one school building, 4K to grade 12, had told us that in the year before there was a lot of concern about the elementary's math progress in terms of their testing. And so they had decided, we've got the idea, we will move the curriculum down for each grade. Second grade will go into first grade. First grade will go into kindergarten. Kindergarten will go into 4K. And she was really worried. She says, we're not ready to write 9 yet. Let's figure out what 9 is. It's not developmentally appropriate yet. Like writing, a lot of kids cannot write yet. And there was talk at our last staff meeting how developmentally appropriate isn't necessarily what's done anymore as the Common Core is brought in. Everything's amped up a little bit. But as far as what their physical ability is, it's still the same. So she was recognizing the concern related to this. What was fascinating was that her classroom was probably the least developmentally appropriate of the ones we saw. There was a lot of coloring and worksheets, and not a lot of focus on the more social emotional types of things. But she still recognized in her professional knowledge that this was going to be a concern. And unfortunately, the only time she could find in her schedule for the following year was to take free choice out and make that math time. Now, this was a school that, because this was a rural school and kids lived far away, and so they would be full day, alternate day kids. So they would go every other day, but a full day. And even given a whole day period, free play was the one fungible thing you could do. Now, what was interesting to me was it sounded exactly like what Lillian Katz said in 1973. How many of you were not alive yet in 1973? Well, let me give you a little bit of history. Lillian Katz said, often teachers say what they're doing, say in kindergarten, is done because the first grade teacher who will receive their pupils expects her to cover it. This is a type of education for the afterlife, always rationalizing today's pedagogy in terms of the next life. And that's one thing that we kept hearing, that you needed to do these things in 4K because of the demands in kindergarten. And we seem to be losing the focus on appreciating the here and now, looking and seeing where kids are and what their interests are, and always focusing on something else. So, how did it work in New Jersey? This was a system that was highly, highly structured in terms of quality. And it was all research-based. But what we found is that the teachers and the administrators often said, but that's not enough. So let's see how that played out. In one district, they used the creative curriculum. And Laura, the early childhood administrator, said, as a teacher who used creative curriculum, it has gaps. It has no scope and sequence. It takes some things for granted. We supplement heavily. I'm a lover of model writing. I expect it in every classroom. And then she went through and talked about this model writing model that she was trying to implement in all the classrooms. So they saw creative curriculum and saw it as an experience-based curriculum, but it didn't feed the direct skills that they knew that they needed to have for later. What we found was that often kindergarten teachers and pre-K teachers had slightly different perspectives. These are teachers from the Norwood district, where they just talked about adding to creative curriculum. And the kindergarten teacher told us it's totally different than we do in kindergarten. And she's talking about what the pre-K program is. Just note the kids have more power to do what they want to do. I think the program's about solving everyday problems through play. Sounds like a good thing to me. I would like them to be ready a lot more than what they are. At least maybe to follow a routine, to hold a pencil, to verbally know what their first and last name, to write their name and some letters and some sounds. So the kindergarten teacher was sounding like the one that Lillian Katz was talking about in terms of setting up expectations for a particular kind of readiness. And Suzanne, the pre-K teacher, told us the kindergarten teachers said that they were prepared social emotionally, but they were not prepared academically. They were saying that the children just play all day and they are given too many choices in preschool. So there's a different idea about what programming looks like. And the children making choices is a big flashpoint between the two. Now, being the ancient woman that I was, and still am, that difference used to be the difference between kindergarten and first grade. But now it's shifted down to pre-K. So what did we learn? We learned that pre-K policy intersects with accountability policy in ways that really shape the pre-K curriculum across both states. It's important to recognize that the pre-K policy in each state was informed by the local values of that state. So in New Jersey, they valued research-based programming that they believed would assure quality implementation. Whereas in Wisconsin, the value of local control was seen as more important than having a lot of rules, because they felt that districts are more likely to be able to know what their children, families, and teachers need. So it ended up being that we had these opposing forces. There were ideas about early childhood notions of quality and then something else. So regardless of the policy intentions, regardless of the ways districts set up their programs or teachers set up their classrooms, pre-K was starting to get pulled into the K-12 orbit. What was interesting is that it wasn't pre-K standards that motivated this evolution. And there's been a fair amount of study done about Wisconsin's development of their early learning standards, that there was a lot of discussion about how they wanted to use those standards to make sure that high quality programming was provided, but they didn't want to have directions that would allow you to make a checklist that would tell you whether a child is ready or not, or whether a program is doing a particular kind of thing. They wanted to leave things open, expecting the professionalism of the early childhood community to be able to ensure that good practices were in place for young children. Those pre-K standards in both states ended up kind of on the side as school district people became more and more interested in 4K as a way to standardize what kids were coming into kindergarten for. And so it was the accountability pressures that have done the same thing of robbing kindergarten of a child-centered focus. So this constant look of accountability to make sure that you have everything lined up narrowed people's visions. So I see this as kind of a game of rocks, papers, and scissors. That the early childhood community has a strong and pretty cohesive perspective that says to be able to do good work in early childhood, you need to have developmental understandings of young children and be able to use them in planning programming and in the one-to-one interactions that teachers and children have. Unfortunately, that coherent view doesn't win if it's the rock and the paper, I get them mixed up, but if it encounters accountability ideology, that has more power in the system of education, and developmentalism hasn't found a way to speak back to that. So one of the things that I hope that we can do through doing work like this is to figure out ways to speak back to the accountability push and to help policymakers and leaders understand how we can actually do good programming with children. So, what are your thoughts? Joan?
I think it's a little disheartening
Yeah?
Yeah, just a little. Especially when I hear about the talk about developing a 4K continuum from the DPI.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if there are any studies that have looked at performance in kindergarten and beyond, comparing kids who come from a more academic preschool environment versus a play-based?
Not recent ones. I mean, the ones that came from, the early work that contrasted direct instruction with, say, high scope. I don't know how much has been looked at here, and one of the things that I think early childhood researchers are puzzled about is how to do good research that will allow you to follow that kind of longitudinal thread. One of the challenges is that nothing stays static in the period in between. And the thing that concerns me a lot is if we've got kind of a narrowing of 4K, what does it mean then for children that have it narrowed even more in 5K and don't have a chance to do more exploratory child-chosen activities over the course of time? And so I see that as the next generation of studies. And it can't be studies where you're piggybacking off of data that was designed for another study and doing secondary analysis, because over and over again, that's what people have been doing for the policy stuff. And I think you miss things when you do that kind of work. Yes?
This is, I think, a related comment. I was thinking back to the excerpt where someone said, the kids come into kindergarten really well prepared social, in terms of their social emotional skills, but the academics aren't there as strongly. And I was thinking, in terms of study design, if there were a way to look at that trade-off, like if kids in a particular more standards-based accountability program do come in with the academic skills, but you can actually measure and show that the social emotional skills are suffering, that it might be a way to kind of get at what the kids are getting and what they aren't getting and how that actually does impact outcomes, because that social emotional foundation seems critical.
The problem is, one, having a great measure of social emotional development, and then two, persuading policymakers that we need to be concerned about that development in relation to other parts of development. So is this going to enhance reading performance later on? Policymakers tend to have a narrow palette when it comes to looking at outcomes and tests. And so I think that would be a piece of something that we need to start with. The other problem is that researchers use tools that are already there, and so we don't develop the kinds of complex measures that will look at children in all their glory. I had a very animated argument with someone who wanted to use PALS scores as a measure of kindergarten readiness. And I tried to explain that it was a really narrow band. It would be like me taking a sample from his cheek to understand what his weight was. It doesn't make sense. But it was a cheap and easy tool to back into a measure of some kind. Yes?
So I have a child care center and we have 4K. So our understanding, so we've been doing it now, we're on our 8th year. So we started out with the understanding that we are doing it so that all children would have an equal beginning before they go to school. And it did help for social and emotional, because if children were in environments that were not good, they would learn positive social and emotional things.
because that would mess up.
Doesn't pertain to the children. But we do creative curriculum. And it works so perfect if they just use that, because what it shows is that every child should be growing. Doesn't
Mhm.
matter if they start here, here, or here. We just want to see that they keep on going up. That's all that should matter. And then what's really sad is that so then the first year, again, when we just did the social play, 5K teachers were thrilled with our children. They knew how to sit and listen and raise their hand. That's all they wanted.
Yep.
And they were excited about that. Now, 5K children are staying in at recess because they can't keep up with the first grade of that curriculum that was put down on the 5K. That makes you want to throw up. That when you're thinking a little 5-year-old who used to be our babies is now going to school full time and can't go out for races, even though all the recesses have been cut anyway. So that social and emotional eventually is going to deteriorate and go into anxiety, stress. These children are just going to be, or they're just going to be horrendous. And they didn't even have time to see what 4K could do because they're already destroying it.
Mhm.
And it's actually getting worse for those little kiddos in second grade, first grade, kindergarten. It breaks your heart. And that's why I'm here today to see if whatever we can do to prevent this or fight against it, we need to do this.
Well, I think to what you asked about is people talk a lot about the pre-K3 alignment project. I think alignment's fine if it goes from early childhood up, so that we're looking at how children develop in building a curriculum rather than building a curriculum almost like a top-down, where if you have to get to Delavan by 3 o'clock, you have to be to Madison by X o'clock. And I think if we actually had ways to have respectful discussions about what can be learned in the K-12 system, in the early childhood or the preschool system, we could actually have some really interesting alignment. But so far, the alignment project hasn't taken into account early childhood practices or beliefs.
It's sort of like early childhood is not a legitimate educational, a piece of education.
Well, you know what's funny is that this is actually what kindergarten was like a number of years ago. When I taught kindergarten, I was in an old building where I had a fireplace in my room. And that was because they saw kindergarten as a place that should be like home. It had a separate entrance. It had different schedules, and I wasn't required to go to all of the professional development things because I was seen as doing something different. Now that kindergarten's been brought into this K-12 system, now the new outlier is 4K. And I wish we could find a way to have 4K be accommodated in that system, to appreciate it for the best things that it does, without becoming homogenized into a system that's for older children. Yes?
Just a couple of things that have struck me recently is we're toward the end of the year, and I'm particularly talking about some kids with special needs here, is when we're sitting down and talking with the school districts about where the kids are at the end of this year, and we look at the 4K standards, and they're saying, oh, well, they've got that, that's great, and so there, there's a tendency to pull some services, which is reasonably okay to consider. But then when I ask, well, what's the standard for the end of kindergarten, and the Grand Canyon leap that's going to be expected in 28 little weeks or whatever the school year is these days, minus all the breaks, is so huge. And the likelihood just for a typically developing child to jump that much in 1 year, again, those standards being laid out for the end of the kindergarten year, whether they're reasonable or not, that's what they are. Let alone a child with special needs who's even doing very well in 4K with good programming, is almost gasping to think that they're going to be able to hold on and not fall into that expectation of, well, we have special needs, we wouldn't expect them to keep up anyway.
fail, I guess fail, then we'll see about pulling services back in. And I was kind of struck by this sense of, well, are the 4K standards reasonable, and then the K standards are just so they've been so far, they've been written to be so exceeding of what we thought kindergartners really should have to do and manage in a year, that then we get to that place where the kindergarten teacher is already freaking out week 1 because they know what they have to get to. And even kids who are doing very well in 4K, very well in 4K, are already seen as like week 1 ready to go because they know they have such a big jump to make, and then don't even get me started on the kids' special needs. The other one that was also a thing is we certainly have children who are in our 4K programs who lean toward the academics. Their strength is some of the academics, their knowledge of colors and numbers and shapes and things and curvature. That's just their strength. And yet they really do need some extra help in some of the navigating play and entering and exiting and figuring out what the group's doing and doing all that. And when we go to kindergarten and we talk, or we go to, again, some kids with special needs, and we talk about what they're going to be great knowing that at 10:02 it's math time, but they need help in some of the other things, the kindergarten teachers will just look at us and say, well, if it's raining, we might have a free choice time. But other than that, like, there is nowhere for them to practice those more free choice, how do I see what the group's doing, go and enter a play scenario, do some dramatic play, and have to go. There's almost no place for them to practice that anymore once they get into the K world. And they're just being bluntly honest, saying, well, hope it rains a lot that year, because then we won't go out for recess and I'll put a little choice time in. So that is what we're hearing. Yeah.
My hope is that, and I'm never an optimist, so this is out of character for me, that anytime you have a system that overcorrects, it'll start coming back. And I have to believe that there will be a recognition that we've moved beyond looking at a child as a whole being and narrow the attention in ways that lessen what the child is. I think the other piece that's important is that in these 4K classrooms, the teachers weren't able to see things like free choice time as a very rich instructional time, where they can get into play with children and learn who the kids are and see what they know and do both assessment types of things and instructional types of things in response to the child. They were too busy with administrative housekeeping and assessment often, that they were like Ms. Zelda, pulling kids out of play outside because she had to get all the things done. And I have to think that there's going to be a period where people are going to see that we're pushing too far in one direction. Yes?
Yeah, I think it's interesting listening to all of this. It seems like we've somehow set up this false dichotomy that either you're going to be academically prepared or you're going to be socially, emotionally developed, and that, like the friendly quotes from the teachers, that either we're going to get kids ready academically or we're going to help them know how to like sift or interplay, and I just find that really odd because that's not sort of consistent with any way that we think of our own selves, and it's, but it seems like everyone has just decided that it's one or the other, and you have to have one kind of curriculum, but that couldn't possibly be achieving multiple goals, which I think is interesting. But what I was wanting you to comment on is some of the literature, like around grit and the idea, you know, just sort of popular in terms of thinking about the need for, you know, emotional regulation and cognitive flexibility, and those types of skills are potentially more important than certain academic skills. And, but it seems to me that might help with some of this debate, right? And sort of what
solutions for
Right.
these?
I think using that as a tool to argument for balanced programming is a very effective tool for policymakers, because then they can see the importance of having both sides of the dichotomy that we make. And I would say that that's the strongest argument for me, because I worry that we're raising a whole group of people that don't have any decisions. Because they haven't had to make decisions. They haven't had to take a risk. They haven't had to figure out how to get to a group that they desperately want to be a part of. And so having a sense of a child as a whole being that you don't need to divvy up into two things. The other piece that's bizarre about that is that in a previous period in my life, I did a lot of work on kindergarten readiness. And in particular, I looked at parents who decided to redshirt their kids. And they took the dichotomy and flipped it, saying, my kid's fine academically, no problem. He read Tolstoy, not really, but right. He's on the 4th level of the Bob books. I have been told that. But they wanted the social part because they recognized the importance of social maturity in having access to the cultures of power. I think always reminding people that children don't come in like a bento box. They're not divided. They're whole things. And any programming we should do should try to keep that child in one piece. I agree 100%. Joan?
Just to respond to Leah, I don't know that early childhood teachers compartmentalize kids and create that dichotomy. I think they're fighting back against the total negation of the importance of all the activities that allow children to make decisions, develop their prefrontal cortex and all of that. I would like to see a study of kids who are totally dysregulated going into kindergarten versus kids who are more mature, social, emotionally, regulation, etc. How are they doing and haven't had direct instruction? I would like to know how they're doing in 3rd grade. Because my hunch would be, even if I don't know my ABCs, if I feel good about myself as a learner, if I'm willing to take intellectual risks, I'm going to learn because I have this strong foundation of how great I am.
Right. One of the puzzles for me is how people at different levels interpret children coming in. In Dixon, the district that I worked in, the daycare center I worked in was known in the city as a place that was willing to work with kids who were behavior problems. They would take children that had been asked to leave other centers, and they spent an incredible amount of time keeping kids engaged in the classroom. What did the kindergarten teachers say? That clearly that school does not know how to get their kids to behave because the kids are well behaved. They weren't willing to think about the kinds of behavioral scaffolding and support the daycare center provided. They just didn't see it. So there was an assumption that those kids were in a school that wasn't good. Instead of, those kids were in a school with broad parameters for what counted as good behavior. Yes?
Has there been anything that looks at this, kind of what you did, but internationally with different countries that are doing better than us on some of these testings and, because the United States isn't really top of the game as far as what we produce out of high school, right? Where some of these other countries are. So what are they doing in 4K?
Well, you look at something like Finland.
Right.
We compare ourselves to Finland. They don't have their kids come to real school
Right.
until much later. They don't learn to read until much later.
Right, so like a case study like this, we're really looking at, even if you picked a couple of years and had different kids and, so you're hitting
That's a
along.
fascinating idea. I'll ask around. That is a great idea.
Because I think that you can really target that at some of the policymakers that we have. Look, they're actually doing this. This is what we're doing, this is what they're doing. And they're getting better results.
What's fascinating is that policymakers often see that and they'll go, but they don't have our kids. They have this idea of that our product resources aren't as good as those in another place. But that would be a great thing to see. Yes?
That's actually been done, in China there's a county, so like say our county, in this county they told the schools they could not have any structure. So, and then no toys, they only played with, so when they went outside they played with sticks, stones, they found barrels and tires, whatever they could find they could play with. And then it actually showed, so they'd go outside and play, and then the teachers would really try to stand back and not get involved. And so this was just came to Madison like maybe 3 or 4 months ago, where the lady was there.
Oh, and she's
Yes. So it's the same thing, and so they did show up, but the best thing that they learned was problem solving. So they would go out and play, then they would come in, and all they would talk about is what did they do, how did it work, what could make it work better.
Yeah.
And it went all through ages. So that would be an easy study for you to get and talk to legislation about that.
Yeah.
But I was going to say too that early childhood, our towns, because now they really stress not to redshirt children, but I do it all the time in my center, like with our little kiddos with challenges. I really stress that they want to stay with me and go into 4K where they're not counted, so they can just go in and get the curriculum, but they're with me all day, like 10 hours, so they could go in for 2 hours. Then the next year I count them as a 4K student, so they can do it twice. And early childhood told me that I couldn't do that. They wanted them to stay with their age group. But you know something, that's great when you're in 3rd grade, stay with 3rd graders and then go to 4th grade. But when you're 3 or 4, that whole year of just being able to grow up before you have to go into the DPI system, I still fight it, and I still think if they have 1 more year of just being a little child where they don't have to go into 4K, I encourage it to the parents. Because once they get 4K, if they're counted, they can't take it again. So that's a shame.
The problem is there's no research that supports that kind of thing. So let me just give you an anecdote from long ago when I did my dissertation. I did my dissertation looking at people's ideas about readiness. And I had spent a whole year with the kindergarten group. And one day in May, a little boy came in with big tears in his eyes. And he goes, "It's my birthday." And I'm thinking, birthday? Tears? Those don't go together. I said, "Hey, what's going on?" And he said, "I don't want anybody to know that I'm 7." He had been redshirted the year before, and he knew that he wasn't like everybody else. And often people say, "Oh, kids don't know." They do. So it's a bone of contention, I think, in a lot of contexts. And I think there are people that say, if you doubt it, do it. And I say, if you doubt it, don't do it. Be the best advocate you can be for your child. So,
Yeah, I say when it comes to social and emotional, and they could just have that 1 year before they start, especially if they're born in August.
I have an August birthday boy.
I mean, my girls for August too, and they did great.
I had a boy. That's much better in the readiness game. And what I did, I actually had people ask me if I was going to hold him out of kindergarten when I was 5 months pregnant. And I said, I think I should look at him. and what I did was every year in the little thing that parents write, I would write a note that said, Sam needs a teacher who isn't afraid of young boys. And I will help you do everything you need to do to help him succeed. And he's now living in Tokyo, working as a translator. It wasn't always pretty in terms of his schooling, but there are all kinds of resources that can be brought to bear for kids. And I think the jury's still out on the red shirt.
Well, we have early childhood that comes into our center and everything, so they get everything. They're really struggling, they still can't talk well, they can't go to the bathroom yet, and they're really struggling. Can't see where one year old.
I'm still not going to agree.
That's okay.
There is research to show that children with special needs who
Identify special needs.
identify special
Yes.
needs do benefit for the reasons you were saying, i.e. having one more year in a preschool setting.
The key is making sure that you have the services and resources that you need. A lot of kids who are registered don't get any services, which is then,
Just holding.
yeah.
And that's what I'm saying, we have everything. We have early childhood coming into our center, we have 4K in our center, so.
I'm not going to agree, so we can just stop.
Yeah, I mean, I have a July birthday, a late July birthday, and I was in Head Start, and then when my parents took me to kindergarten, they told my parents maybe they should consider holding me for another year. And my dad said, well, they're not going to take her back to Head Start, and you're not going to take her to kindergarten. She's going to sit home for a year? I don't think so. Like that makes no sense whatsoever. In those situations, that is ridiculous to register a child.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
So, anything else any other questions, comments? Yes?
I'm wondering what can an individual person do to try to, give feedback to the policymakers? Where do you think you should put your energy?
That's been a mystery to me. I think that at this point, the best pressure points would be in terms of school district leaders. Because I'm told by school district administration that there are no policies in place that require kindergarten teachers not to have playtime. That this is decision making that's made at the school level. So I think as an individual, there's probably limited leverage you can have. But I think a group of strong professionals who can make a good argument for what's appropriate practice, asking for a hearing at the school district or asking for a hearing at DPI or with senators or representatives.
I think it's also really important that we get parents as consumers on our side
Yes.
too, because so many times you sit around a table and the parents, all they know to ask is, well, what are their ABCs and their colors, and they're ready for this, and they don't know that it's important to ask for. Some of them don't know that
Right.
it's important because they want to see the outcomes that are highlighted in the news too. So,
Right.
making sure that parents know that this is important.
I think I'm worried that we're going to have a generation of early childhood educators that don't know how to facilitate high quality learning in more informal formal contexts. So the ability to be able to teach those things that parents want within play. It's harder to do, way more fun though. And so we need to make sure that providing professional development and teacher education that's appropriate for children from birth to age 8. But parents are definitely a piece of the puzzle. Julie?
Yeah, and I would add to that that the other, I believe, important piece of having parents at the table when talking about 4K and these potential grades for kindergarten is to talk about what structures are actually accessible to most families. Like we talked about with Madison right now with the cart day, parents who can figure out how to get their kids to the cart day and or afford to have their child in wraparound child care or a child care that provides 4K is actually quite limiting to a lot of families. So that's an important piece too. Because this kind of starts to dip into that economic need for families when you're before kindergarten where kids don't have full day. And so that's a really important piece of this that also contributes to how much this is actually aggressively achieved before kindergarten.
How does DPI work with it? Like you say, school districts can make those choices, but then how, like I've
School
talked
districts can make which choices?
so like, to know, have to make time for play and stuff like that, because like, our 4K, like, we started out so fun, you know, and the children just learn so many social skills, and they learn by the time. But then all of a sudden, when they say, oh, we have to do PALs, like, our principal and like, our school district said, you just have to do it, because that's what DPI says. How do you get to DPI? Like, tomorrow.
That was done by the state.
Yeah, so that was done by the state.
Yeah, the legislature put PALs in. There was a governor's task force on reading. And it's actually very funny the way that PALs was inserted, that it wasn't, it just kind of flew in.
Right.
And it's also the case that they don't have to use PALs anymore. The district can choose a different tool if they will use it to track kids over time. And so that's an important thing because there are actually measures that provide more information in a broader sense of kindergarten readiness than PALS does.
And the PALS that we use, the PALS that Madison uses, is a limited version of PALS.
Yes.
There is a PALS with a lot more information.
Yep.
PALS gets a lot more if you use the whole thing.
But then you have to use the whole thing.
Right, instead of just using this
Yes.
portion.
I think we should
Yes.
wrap it up.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.